Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
People use words incorrectly all the time. Like the words broke and poor are 2 different words, 2 very different meanings. But people always mix them up. One of my best friends, he keeps on complaining about how poor he is because he bought a condo. I'm like, no! You're just broke because you made an investment. And on the other hand, our other friend is a barista, and every weekend he'll be like, I can't do anything this weekend. I'm broke. And then I'm like, no. You're poor. Because you have a liberal arts degree, right? Like, you're never gonna fit into the economy anywhere, ever. You're not just poor, you're in big trouble. Like, serious trouble. For sure. You know how I know that? Because I have a liberal arts degree. Yeah, and it's in economics, which is the best degree you can get if you want to really understand why you're unemployed. When you graduate with a BA in economics, the world's like, congratulations, you're jobless. And then you're like, yes, I've read articles about this. I know what to do in theory.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Wiker Saturday, September the 7th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, ideas have consequences, grow up, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the 10 books every conservative must read. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
That business people buy low and sell high in a particularly alert and advantageous way does not make them bad unless all trading is bad. Unless when you yourself shop prudently, you are bad. Unless any tall poppy needs to be cut down. Unless we wish to run our ethical lives on the sin of envy. Deirdre N. McCloskey. This should be the most self-evident of statements, but because of the politics of envy that drives so much of modern economics, it is not. The transactions of successful business people are not evil when they are profitable, any more than our own endeavors in transacting in the marketplace become suddenly noble when done foolishly, or suddenly evil when done effectively. The derogatory way that so many speak of business success reveals an entire ecosystem of envy.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Again, you ought to take a leaf out of Crazy George's book and dissolve various legislative bodies just for the hell of it. After all, you can't do any worse than the venal and acquisitive klepto-clowns we already have in there. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Now this one is rich. Here you guys have been bitching about the out-of-control judiciary, and good King George was practically handing what you wanted on the same silver platter that once bore the head of Mary, Queen of Scots. And you complain about it? He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. So what? That's how you do it when you're doing it right. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Okay. You probably have a beef here. If there's one thing we lefties know how to do, it's to send out swarms of officers to harass your people, eat out your substance, and then have the gall to ask for more. What's ours is ours, and what's yours is not only negotiable, our old position, but outright forfeit, our new, more nuanced stance. In fact, swarming is one of the things we do best. When we see an opening, whether it's the New Frontier or the Great Society or the New Covenant, remember that one? Neither do I. Or Hope and Change. We give it all we got. So should you. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. For suspending our own legislatures, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. What all these antiquated kvetches basically boil down to is this. It sucks being on the short end of a political argument, especially when the other guy's got all the troops and the firepower. So start the counter-revolution already, why don't you? He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Don't get me started. We long ago declared your side out of our protection and have openly waged war against you. Except you were too dumb to notice. Osama spent years of yelling at you and issuing fatwas and blowing things up in Africa before he got the notion to fly those planes into the World Trade Center. And then you finally figured out you were at war with an ideological movement, not just a bunch of street punks that the New York City Police Department could use the plunger on. Naturally, we immediately set about disabusing you of this conviction almost immediately. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Yup. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. I think you call that amnesty, right? He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. Except that now, our own citizens voluntarily travel across the high seas and take up arms against their country. Everybody from Johnny Jihad in California to the Somalis in Minneapolis, who turn up on the battlefields in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda trained and ready to punch out their fellow Americans. And why shouldn't they? After all, they've immigrated to a country that tells them, thanks to us and our pet historians, like the late Howard Zinn, that patriotism is a vice, not a virtue. That America deserves every bad thing she gets and still has a lot of payback coming to her. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do.
And that was Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, grow up. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. Most of the books that I've been reading, they have a tendency to be written narrative style. Once upon a time, they started at the beginning. And I'm not interested in the beginning. I'm not reading the books because I'm interested in the history of this, that, or the other thing. I want these folks to get to the point. But their point is always at the back of the book, the last chapter or chapters of the book. So with this one, I'm going straight to the last chapter, chapter 20. We're going to read that one, and then I'll take a look for next week at chapter 19. And we'll go back as far as I think is necessary. And so here we go with chapter 20, Grow Up, from Dr. Everett Piper.
Lesson 20. Sit at the exit door. We are all faced with a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. Chuck Swindoll. True adults. A society desperate for leaders always turns its eyes to the next generation, and there are lots of reasons to be searching for leadership now. With the rapid decline in original thought, intellectual freedom, and open debate, the masses fall in line. American education seems intent on producing propaganda rather than sound pedagogy. Teachers seem to yearn for carbon copies of themselves rather than graduates who can think for themselves. Today's academic establishment is in the business of requiring that students follow the leader and punishing those who dare to lead. Leadership is out. Falling in line is in. The maturity and confidence to think for yourself is, at its heart, a call to leadership. Adults obviously have more freedom than children. They've lived long enough to learn from their mistakes, discard the ideas that didn't work, and embrace the good ideas that have merit. True adults don't have to conform to arbitrary authority, for they can see the reasons underpinning justified authority. They lead as much as they follow, and they follow as much as they lead. They understand the paradox of discipline and freedom. They understand what it means to lead through example rather than by threats. Real adults understand that leadership is service, not sanctimony. They intuitively take to heart the words of Christ. He who loses his life will gain it, and the first will be last, and the last will be first. Adults are willing and eager to stand alone, and by their integrity, and sometimes with very few words, to say, "Follow me," when everyone else seems all too willing to follow the crowd. Flight time. On any plane, someone needs to sit at the exit door. If you've flown much, you know that these seats are often desirable because they come with extra legroom. But during the pre-flight briefing from the flight attendant, those sitting in that row are always asked if they're willing and able to carry out the responsibilities of helping others get off the plane in case of an emergency. Now, I've flown my fair share, and I've yet to see anyone refuse to accept this leadership role. Everyone says, yes, if there's a crisis, I'm willing to keep my head about me, step forward in the midst of panic, and do what no one else will do. I'll open the door and lead. But by and large, the exact opposite is true for our society as a whole. Few seem willing today to say, I don't care what everyone else does or doesn't do. I will lead. This hasn't always been the case. Once a year on September 11, images of the most horrific attack on the mainland United States flash across our television screens. We've all watched it over and over. We've all seen the planes as they crash into the towers, heard the frantic phone calls that were recorded, and watched the Twin Towers collapse to the ground as an immense cloud of dust and debris billows its way down the streets and alleyways of New York City. However, if you aren't watching closely enough, you'll fail to see the heart of leadership on display. In the midst of the chaos, firefighters, police, and paramedics ran toward the catastrophe, not away from it. Rather than preserving themselves and their own safety, they instinctively did their duty. They weren't thinking of their own lives, but the lives of everyone else. They're true leaders, true heroes. They didn't even seem to think about themselves at all. Sacrifice seemed as natural to them as breathing. They saw the reward of risking it all to save someone else. This is leadership. Leadership sets convenience aside. Leaders have conviction and a driving principle. Leaders take the reins rather than waiting for others to do so, regardless of the cost. The leaders that history judges as the greatest are those whose love for a cause and passion for a mission are so irresistible that they cannot help but take the reins, and others can't help but rally behind them. They can't remain silent. Inaction is not an option for them. Leaders don't stick their finger up to determine which way the proverbial winds are blowing. They don't pander or reverse course because of polls or popularity. Leaders boldly declare, with Martin Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Many of those who ran into the buildings on 9/11 lost their lives trying to save the lives of others, sacrificing all they had for those they didn't even know. They acted not for fame or for glory, not for selfish preservation or self-centered gain. They led simply because it was the right thing to do. Another unforgettable story of the leadership witnessed on 9/11 came from the plane that crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Realizing that the plane had been hijacked and believing that it would be used to cause more damage, passengers rose up to take down the hijackers. The phrase, "let's roll," grew in popularity after it was spoken by Todd Beamer as he and several of his fellow passengers made their way toward the hijackers. The determination and courage of Beamer and the crew of Flight 93 will never be forgotten. Rather than sitting still and following instructions, they fought back. They gave their lives and in turn saved the lives of thousands who were the intended targets of a terrorist attack. Learning how to lead. For over 17 years, I was blessed to be a university president. During my time at the helm, we went from financial exigency to a model of fiscal health. Enrollment more than doubled, as did revenue. Debt was paid down to zero, and net assets increased from about 10 to 40 million. Perhaps most important, the university's reputation grew from relative obscurity to one of national leadership. We were repeatedly cited as a champion of academic freedom and religious liberty. While sailing a ship that even Peter Drucker once said was impossible to sail, I learned some key lessons, some through success, some through failure, all by God's grace and patience. Here are just 10 lessons I learned while navigating some pretty rough waters. The first lesson in leadership is that if you inherit failure, break it and start over. It's been said to never let a good crisis go to waste, and that's so true. If you're blessed to be given charge of a sinking ship, you can always lead more boldly than you could ever lead if you were given charge of an organization that was healthy. Take advantage of the opportunity presented to you. Don't squander it. Rather than trying to cure cancer by applying a Band-Aid, cut out the disease. Get rid of the carcinogens. Break the cycle, and don't hesitate to break the organization. This is the only way that you will save it. Don't let the crisis go to waste. Use the crisis as a launch pad for something different, a new plan, a new direction to elevate the company to a new level. The second lesson is this: if you inherit success, don't break it. If you're fortunate enough to take over something that is working, build upon the success. If your organization enjoyed success before you were hired, your job is don't screw it up. Celebrate the things that have worked and keep doing them. The person running the leg ahead of you in the race was likely there because he was faster. Be thankful that he gave you a lead. Focus on the goal at hand, and whatever you do, don't drop the baton. Take it and run forward. Your ego will tempt you to ignore all the good and give too much time and attention to the few things that are bad. Leaders are always tempted to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but true leadership identifies success and builds upon it. The third lesson in leadership is that if you want to make everyone happy, don't be a leader. Choose something different. Go sell ice cream. If you're a friend to all and an enemy to none, then you're a leader of no one. The best coach I ever had made it very clear that he was not my friend. He was my coach. He understood that in order to instill in me what I needed to perform, he could not try to appease me all the time. He needed to push me. He needed to test me. Rather than being my friend, he had to stoke the fire inside me to prevail. If popularity becomes more important to you than doing what's right for your organization, then it's time to resign and move on to something else. The pursuit of popularity is a waste of time. The fourth lesson I learned was never, ever bend a knee to the mob. When you're right, stand tall and refuse to bow. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. It is better to lose your head than to lose your soul. Conviction is respected. Weakness is not." The next lesson of leadership is that truth matters most. Demand truth. Defend it. Model it. Never compromise it. Never supplant it. Truth must always be first. Without truth, there is no trust. Without truth, you'll have no team. Devoid of truth, there is no change. If there is no truth, there is no gospel and there is no grace. There's a reason that Jesus defines himself as the truth. Truth is central in leadership. The minute you put something else ahead of truth is the minute you have designated yourself to be a follower and not a leader. Simply put, if anything is more important to you than truth, you have already failed. Building upon that lesson of leadership, the next lesson is this: if you're not willing to lose the battle, you will never win the war. Your personal success is not the top priority. Yes, there are a plethora of books on how to find success, maintain success, how to look successful, and so on. But true leadership is not about you. Be willing to suffer defeat for doing what you know is right. The cause for which you fight is more important than your resume or your career. Rather than turning and running away from the storm, which is the natural reaction of followers, run straight into the face of the storm. Wave the banner. If you win, great. That's God's grace. If you lose, who cares? At least you went down fighting. The seventh lesson of leadership is to care enough to confront others. Because after all, like I said earlier, your job isn't to be liked. Those who talk about grace, love, and compassion in juxtaposition to truth, discipline, and confrontation are nearly always more interested in being liked than they are in leading. If you were to Google enablement, you'll likely find their picture. Case in point, parents who strive to be liked by their children at the expense of discipline raise up kids who have no idea there is a universe that they're not the center of. Children who are always liked by their parents are almost never liked by anybody else. Grace without truth, love without discipline, and compassion without confrontation are false dichotomies. You can't argue for water without rain, harvest without seed, or heat without fire. If you want to raise up a virtuous people, then you have to be willing to confront their vices. Too much support and too little challenge result in stagnation rather than growth. Remember the truth that the Lord disciplines those he loves. If the Lord uses discipline to encourage growth, our leadership should do the same. James wrote, "As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." The same can be said about leadership that is more concerned with likability than productivity. Being liked is far less valuable than being respected. Leaders choose to confront rather than enable. The eighth lesson of leadership I can share with you is to double down and refuse to give in to doubt. Everyone has friends and foes. We will all be criticized by some and praised by others. The way to know who to listen to is simple. What's their track record? If your critics are failures in their own lives, ignore them. If the critic is someone who has nothing invested and chooses to sit on the sidelines and critique in hopes of tearing you down, I suggest you take to heart the words of President Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at worst, if he fails, at least fails daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold, timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Roosevelt knew that leaders are more often torn apart by those who are not in the arena than by those who are. If those who offer criticism are more successful than you, listen to them. If those challenging you have done more than you, then humble yourself and pay attention. For the words they share and the insight they offer may be what helps you grow into a more effective leader. Be grateful for their coaching. If those complaining about you have never accomplished much, however, take their criticism with a grain of salt. When small men and malcontents are shooting arrows at your back, it's a sure sign you're going in the right direction. Keep going. Stay the course. Double down and refuse to give in to doubt. The ninth lesson in leadership is to stay on message. Too often the vision is lost when the message is vague or shifting. Staying on point is key to becoming effective as a leader. It has often been said that there are 3 secrets to success, and they are repetition, repetition, and repetition. Winston Churchill famously modeled single-minded focus when he said, "Never give in. Never, 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 never give in." If there's anything that distinguishes great leaders from those that fail, it is the confidence to speak their message with clarity and courage and passion and to do it over and over again. Be a one-string banjo. Wave your banner and then wave it again and again. Shout your battle cry, then shout it over and over again. Sooner or later, you will find that not only those following you believe it, but so do you. By staying on message, you model consistency and the vision necessary to lead others. The 10th lesson in leadership is that if you want to find a snake, listen for the rattle. Some say that there are only two things that are sure in life, death and taxes. It's hard to argue with that truth. However, I'd add a third, gossip. Leaders are maligned. Leaders are the targets of every form of innuendo, exaggerated stories, and even blatant lies. If you're leading, sure as the sunrise, people will gossip about you. The best advice I ever received was this: Mr. President, just be quiet. When people speak ill of you, just be quiet. When naysayers sow dissension about you, just be quiet. When you're falsely accused, just be quiet. The best way to find the snake is to listen for the rattle. Let the snakes around you make the noise, and eventually they'll be the ones to lose their heads. Don't rattle. Let your success do the talking. Just be quiet and lead. The Apostle James said, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." Just as knowing what Jesus said is only as good as the commitment we make to apply those truths to our lives, the same can be said about leadership. Being taught how to lead is only as good as the application of those lessons. Adults do things. Children don't. Adults lead. Children follow. Adults take action. Children sit. Adults run toward storms. Children run and hide. Adults rush into falling buildings while children watch to see what happens. Adults have courage. Children cower. Followers are content in being directed where to go, what to do, what to think, and how to feel. Leaders, however, set the tone. The tone doesn't set them. Their leadership begins at home. Setting the example for family extends beyond those walls and into the world, impacting their community, their company, and their church. No one can force you to lead. Leading is a decision to sacrifice. It's a decision to serve. It's a decision to give rather than take, to run rather than stand, to fight rather than surrender. It's a decision to rush into burning buildings. It's the commitment to wave the banner. Let's roll. And having the confidence to know that if you lose waving that banner, it doesn't matter. Leading is about conviction. Leading is about commitment. Leading is about courage and character. It's about acting like an adult rather than a child.
And that was lesson 20, Sit at the Exit Door, from Grow Up, Life Isn't Safe, But It's Good, by Dr. Everett Piper. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we pick up where we left off with the book Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver.
It is apparent that logic depends upon the dream and not the dream upon it. We must admit this when we realize that logical processes rest ultimately on classification. That classification is by identification, and that identification is intuitive. It follows, then, that a waning of the dream results in confusion of counsel, such as we behold on all sides in our time. Whether we describe this as decay of religion or loss of interest in metaphysics, the result is the same. For both are centers with power to integrate, and if they give way, there begins a dispersion which never ends until the culture lies in fragments. There can be no doubt that the enormous exertions made by the Middle Ages to preserve a common worldview, exertions which took forms incomprehensible to modern man because he does not understand what is always at stake under such circumstances, signified a greater awareness of realities than our leaders exhibit today. The schoolmen understood that the question, universalia ante rem or universalia post rem, or the question of how many angels can stand on the point of a needle, so often cited as examples of scholastic futility, had incalculable ramifications, so that, unless there was agreement upon these questions, unity in practical matters was impossible. For the answer supplied that with which they bound up their world. The ground of this answer was the fount of understanding and of evaluation. It gave the heuristic principle by which societies and arts could be approved and regulated. It made one's sentiment toward the world rational, with the result that it could be applied to situations without plunging man into sentimentality on the one hand, or brutality on the other. The imposition of this ideational pattern upon conduct relieves us of the direful recourse to pragmatic justification. Here indeed lies the beginning of self-control, which is a victory of transcendence. When a man chooses to follow something which is arbitrary as far as the uses of the world go, he is performing a feat of abstraction. He is recognizing the noumenal, and it is this, and not that self-flattery which takes the form of the study of his own achievements, that dignifies him. Such is the wisdom of many oracular sayings. Man loses himself in order to find himself. He conceptualizes in order to avoid an immersion in nature. It is our destiny to be faced originally with the world as our primary datum, but not to end our course with only a wealth of sense impressions. In the same way that our cognition passes from a report of particular details to a knowledge of universals, so our sentiments pass from a welter of feeling to an illumined concept of what one ought to feel. This is what is known as refinement. Man is in the world to suffer his passion, but wisdom comes to his relief with an order of conventions which shape and elevate that passion. The task of the creators of culture is to furnish the molds and the frames to resist that sinking in upon the moral being which comes of accepting raw experience. Without the transcendental truth of mythology and metaphysics, that task is impossible. One imagines that Jakob Burckhardt had a similar thought in mind when he said, "Yet there remains with us the feeling that all poetry and all intellectual life were once the handmaids of the holy and have passed through the temple." The man of self-control is he who can consistently perform the feat of abstraction. He is therefore trained to see things under the aspect of eternity, because form is the enduring part. Thus, we invariably find in the man of true culture a deep respect for forms. He approaches even those he does not understand with awareness that a deep thought lies in an old observance. Such respect distinguishes him from the barbarian on the one hand, and the degenerate on the other. The truth can be expressed in another way by saying that the man of culture has a sense of style. Style requires measure, whether in space or time, for measure imparts structure, and it is structure which is essential to intellectual apprehension. That it does not matter what a man believes is a statement heard on every side today. The statement carries a fearful implication. If a man is a philosopher in the sense with which we started, what he believes tells him what the world is for.
And that was another part of Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver and read by Frederick Davidson. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Stoic.
When you lose control. The soul is like a bowl of water, and our impressions are like the ray of light falling upon the water. When the water is troubled, it appears that the light itself is moved too, but it isn't. So when a person loses their composure, it isn't their skills and virtues that are troubled, but the spirit in which they exist. And when that spirit calms down, so do those things. Epictetus, Discourses, 3.3.20 through 22. You messed up a little, or maybe you messed up a lot. So, that doesn't change the philosophy that you know. It's not as if your reasoned choice has permanently abandoned you. Rather, it was you who temporarily abandoned it. Remember that the tools and aims of our training are unaffected by the turbulence of the moment. Stop. Regain your composure. It's waiting for you.
And that was The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The Lord says to you, what do you want? I'll give it to you. I promise. I'll give it to you. What would you ask for? A nicer car? Or Lord, you clear up these disputes in my family? Or Lord, make them like me better? Or Lord, make me more successful in my job? Don't ask for that. It's all trivial nonsense. Ask for Christ. Lord, I want you. I want a wise and discerning heart, so that now I will know what to do with anything, listen, that I might have or not have. So if I've got a wise and discerning heart, well, then I'll know what to do with the wealth that I have if I get that wealth. I'll know what to do with power if it comes to me. I'll know what to do when people honor me. I'll know how to use that for God's purpose. But if I don't have Christ, all those things will turn on me and destroy me. Take that to the bank, everybody.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, from the First Church of Ayn Rand. Quote, the next time you hear about a crazed gang of juvenile delinquents, don't look for such explanations as slum childhood, economic underprivilege, or parental neglect. Look at the moral atmosphere of the country, at the example set by their elders and by their public leaders. Unquote. It's Ayn Rand, Our Cultural Value Deprivation from the Voice of Reason. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
Subtle acts of sabotage can work wonders in the passive-aggressive strategy because you can camouflage them under your friendly, compliant front. That was how the film director Alfred Hitchcock would outmaneuver the meddlesome producer David O. Selznick, who used to alter the script to his liking, then show up on the set to make sure it was shot the way he wanted it. On these occasions, Hitchcock might arrange for the camera to malfunction, or let it run without any film in it. By the time Selznick saw the edit, reshooting would be expensive and impossible. Meanwhile, the director would make a show of being happy to see Selznick on set and bewildered if the camera didn't roll, or rolled but recorded no film. Passive aggression is so common in daily life that you have to know how to play defense as well as offense. By all means, use the strategy yourself. It is too effective to drop from your armory. But you must also know how to deal with those semi-conscious passive-aggressive types so prevalent in the modern world, recognizing what they are up to before they get under your skin, and being able to defend yourself against this strange form of attack.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. So you may as well, if you're a Democrat, you may as well vote Republican. And the reason is because you're not being given any option. Kamala Harris is becoming more of a Republican than a Democrat. She's not providing clear difference from the Republicans. She keeps co-opting the ideas that Donald Trump has come up with first. So, as Harry Truman once said, if you give the people a choice between voting Republican and voting Republican, they'll vote Republican every time. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, 10 books every conservative must read, and this is a 48-minute chapter, and I'm not going to play the entire chapter in one go. So what I'm going to do instead is divide it up into 3, and we'll do it over the next 3 weeks. So we'll do 16 minutes per week. Here we go.
Chapter 14, The Jerusalem Bible. Who do men say that I am? Why this translation? Nearly everyone has a favorite translation of the Bible, usually the one he grew up reading. I have little interest in putting forth the Jerusalem Bible as the best and only translation, but great interest in its being the most unfamiliar, for the whole aim of this chapter is to get readers to discover the Bible as if it were a story they'd never read. A familiar translation breeds, not contempt perhaps, but a kind of coziness that makes our minds less awake. To rediscover the story of the Bible, we cannot tread its pages like a well-worn path. It must become an adventure again. We must become enchanted by the story as a story, in just the same way that, with Tolkien, we become enchanted by the secondary world he created in The Lord of the Rings. We must enter the biblical world as a strange and fascinating secondary world. Why? Precisely because we are generally guilty of confusing our world, that is, our world as defined by our contemporary culture, with the world of the Bible. We envision Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Joshua, Saul, Samuel, King David, Isaiah, John the Baptist, Mary, and Joseph in our imagination as white people with bathrobes who would quite comfortably fit into a suburban afternoon of backyard grilling and light conversation on the patio. In truth, if Abraham or Sarah showed up at your door on a Saturday afternoon, you would call the police. The ancient Jews are as alien to us, in look, in speech, in what they considered important, in how they understood reality, as the elves or dwarves of Tolkien's Middle-earth. The biblical world was a world of tribes and tribal deities, of people defined by families and clans, a world of extraordinary brutality and even more extraordinary hospitality, where life was lived close to the soil, completely dependent on rain and sun, the health of the herd, the luck of the hunt. A world where a man's worth was measured by the strength of his sword and the number of sheep and goats he could call his own. A world in which shepherds could become kings. The King James Version of the Bible, however great its literary merits, was written in 17th century English, and certainly to our ears sounds elegant and ornate, and a little obscure, but it is not the language of an ancient tribe. Modern Americanese translations that press the Bible into our parlance have the effect of entirely removing the great distance separating our way of life, our way of thinking, from that of the ancient Jews, the result being that we are not looking into the depths of history, but into the shallow reflection of a mirror. But the Jerusalem Bible, while not perfect, is certainly unfamiliar to most of us. It is also, I would argue, much closer to the straightforward epic language of the original. By epic, I don't mean flowery, but simple and at times almost brutal, the tongue of the tribal warrior, a language much more akin to what we find in the Iliad or the Lord of the Rings. That is because the ancient Jews' way of life was closer to the way of life portrayed in Homer or Tolkien. At its best, the Jerusalem Bible evokes the speech of a tribe with its tribal deity, the speech of men with swords, strong, powerful, proud fighters led by kings, cunning, wise, foolish, ruthless, arrogant, humbled, holy, and profane kings. The speech of harrowing and strange prophets who continually struck at kings and the people in the name of the tribal deity, laying upon them the most violent and effective curses, the most outrageous threats, and setting before them impossibly good rewards. The speech of real priests, blood-sacrificing, smoke and incense, stone altar priests. That is not our world, but it is the world we need to enter. Now, it is a very interesting fact that J.R.R. Tolkien is listed among the principal collaborators in translation and literary revision of the Jerusalem Bible, the 1966 version, not the later and lesser one, the New Jerusalem Bible. As it turns out, the general editor, Alexander Jones, contacted Tolkien because of Tolkien's impressive command of the English language, as evidenced in The Lord of the Rings. It is interesting to me, anyway, since it was only after reading The Lord of the Rings aloud with my family and watching the 3 movies that I was finally able to read the Bible. By read, I mean read with real excitement, deep understanding, and fascination, or in a word, with enchantment. As you may have guessed, the Jerusalem Bible was the translation through which this enchantment was effected. Here, for example, the beginning of Psalm 28. I cry to you, Yahweh, my rock. Do not be deaf to me, for if you are silent, I shall go down to the pit like the rest. Or Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 to 7. At the time when Yahweh God made earth and heaven, there was as yet no wild bush on the earth, nor had any wild plant sprung up, for Yahweh God had not sent rain on the earth, nor was there any man to till the soil. However, a flood was rising from the earth and watering all the surface of the soil. Yahweh God fashioned man of dust from the soil. Then he breathed into the nostrils a breath of life, and thus man became a living being. Or the victory song sung after crossing the Red Sea, Exodus chapter 15, verse 13. Yahweh I sing, he has covered himself in glory. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Yahweh is my strength, my song. He is my salvation. This is my God. I praise him. The God of my father, I extol him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Yah is another form of Yahweh. To dwell on the obvious, the Jerusalem Bible is not only very direct and simple, it dares to print the name chosen by God himself, Yahweh, his name for all time, the name by which he shall be invoked for all generations to come, Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. The effect created, at least in me, was startling, since, along with everyone else, I had always read the circumspect Lord, which is politely inserted into the text wherever Yahweh actually appears. But when you read a translation that prints Yahweh where it occurs, you suddenly realize how many times one actually finds it in the Old Testament. As a consequence, you feel far more deeply with the personal name the very personal relationship the Jews had with the Almighty. It is like the difference between the generic name Lord, which could apply even to human beings, and the personal name Jesus, or Yeshua, from Yehoshua, Yahweh saves. Moreover, substituting Lord obscures essential prophetic connections. Isaiah says, a voice cries, prepare in the wilderness a way for Yahweh. Make a straight highway for our God across the desert. The prophetic fulfillment duplicated in Matthew to announce the coming of Jesus reads, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord, Greek kurios, make his paths straight. The Greek word for Lord or Master, kurios, is used by the New Testament writers to stand for Yahweh in deference to the commendable Hebrew custom of never pronouncing the name Yahweh when it appeared in the Old Testament. But in putting Lord in the passage in Isaiah, we lose the startling assertion that Matthew is making to the Jews of his day. This man Jesus is Yahweh, our God, Yahweh in the flesh. To return to a previous point, I don't mean to overestimate the place of Tolkien in the making of the Jerusalem Bible. In fact, he worked only on the translation of Jonah. But obviously, the general editor, in inviting Tolkien, was affirming the kind of English style he thought best represented the simplicity and directness of the original languages, a style he himself had encountered in reading The Lord of the Rings, a style that can jolt us out of complacent familiarity with the Bible so that we once again read it in wonder as a story. The Bible as story. What I needed in reading the Bible was to enter another world, leaving my own behind. That kind of literary effect was exactly what Tolkien had in mind in creating the secondary world of Lord of the Rings, a self-contained cosmos integrally woven with marvelous skeins, a world in which even what is familiar becomes strange. Again, what I ask of readers is simply this. For once in your life, read the Bible as a story, as you would the Lord of the Rings. Lay aside the familiar translation, the familiar ideas of what you think is going on, the familiar themes, and enter into the Bible as an epic drama, a piece of great literature. Read it as having a deep, integrated, unfolding plot, rather than from the standpoint of belief or unbelief. Become immersed in it exactly as you would any other great piece of literature where you find yourself, through your captured imagination, experiencing the story from within, as the characters themselves experience it, not digging around to find out whether this or that thing is an actual fact, or how what this or that character says applies to you or your time, but living in the story itself, and following out all the myriad entwined threads that trace the intricacies of the plot as they unfold around you. What I am trying to exclude are all the kinds of questions and attitudes that would block our imaginative immersion into the text as a secondary world. We would not ask, on reading Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, well, was there really a Jacob Marley? Or remark with a snort, this is a silly, childish book. It begins with a door knocker that changes into a ghastly image of a man long dead. Nor would we engage in questions about why Dickens wrote it, or try to boil the whole thing down to the cultural context, or snuffle around looking for bits and pieces of the story in previous works by different authors so as to show our own cleverness in discovering its unoriginality. These are the ways that scholars ruin the story for themselves and everyone else. So, to the scholar and skeptic, I say just read it as you would A Christmas Carol. In reading Dickens, we accept that in this story there are ghosts, several of them, and that the appearance of Marley's face on Scrooge's door knocker is entirely appropriate and integral to the plot. If we do not feel the terror of the ghosts, and even more, the inner moral horror of Ebenezer Scrooge slowly revealed to him by these ghosts, the greatness of the story and the truths it teaches will be lost on us. The primary truth served is not the tasteless moral pablum, be nice to poor people. Rather, it is the horrifying experience of a damned soul and the exhilarating experience of its redemption. That is not a truth we understand outside the story, as if the moral could be written on an index card or a bumper sticker. It's an experience that we have through immersion in the story as real while we are reading it. So also, when reading the Bible, we must accept that in this story, a terrible deity does create merely by speaking things into existence, that he reveals himself in fire to a man named Moses, that water does spring from a rock on command, that the outcome of battles does depend on whose tribal deity is real, and that a seemingly ordinary man does cure lepers with a word, and demons shriek in terror at his presence. If we do not accept these things, we will never experience the truths the Bible reveals. And I'm speaking here not just to skeptics. Too often, believers are searching the Bible for a set of moral or theological dicta that, once found, count as the revelation. The obvious ill effect of this approach is that the biblical story doesn't really matter. It is merely a vehicle on which slogans are painted. Once the key didactic passages have been picked out, one can safely dispense with the story itself. But if that were all God wanted to say, and indeed how he wanted to say it, the Bible would have been a considerably shorter and easier text. To experience the Bible as a story, by contrast, means that we allow ourselves to enter into the wonders, terrors, miracles, brutalities, uncertainties, triumphs, tragedies, the joy and the anguish experienced by the characters. We must go into battle with them, cry alone on our beds with them, thrash ourselves for our moral failures, experience the terror of a prophecy of doom settling upon us, and the unnameable ecstasy of a glorious prophecy beyond our wildest hopes taking shape in our midst. But above all, we must let the story unfold as a story, that is, as it was written, rather than spot reading for juicy bits or jumping around as if the plot were entirely inconsequential. As with any novel, the deeper meaning of what happens at the end depends upon how well we, as readers, attend to the beginning and middle. To take the most important instance, who Jesus is in the New Testament cannot be understood apart from the successive revelation of who Yahweh is in the Old Testament. Jesus, the man, actually appears in the way that the Jews, from all their prophecies, had expected Yahweh to come, except that the very last thing they expected was that the metaphorical language about God in the Old Testament, Yahweh having arms, legs, eyes, and a mouth, and so on, was going to be taken with shocking literalness in the Incarnation. Jesus fulfills the prophecies of Yahweh's entrance into Jerusalem, but in a way the Jews did not imagine. As a Jewish man, as a son who no doubt bore a significant resemblance to his mother Mary, and in whose veins ran the blood of Jewish kings and shepherds. He bore in himself all the particularities of the Jews' long history. He is, in sum, the flesh and blood culmination of all the previous chapters leading up to him, the culmination of Yahweh's revelation about himself. The literary threads that connect Yahweh with Jesus are everywhere for patient readers of the whole story. In Malachi chapter 3 verse 1, the prophet, speaking in the name of Yahweh, says, "Look, I am going to send my messenger to prepare a way before me, and the Lord you are seeking will suddenly enter his temple, and the angel of the covenant, whom you are longing for. Yes, he is coming, says Yahweh Sabaoth." This entry will not be pleasant. Malachi is speaking of the dread day of Yahweh, when he will come to purge the temple. In Matthew, Jesus identifies the messenger with John the Baptist, and hence Yahweh with himself. Matthew chapter 11 verse 10. Of course, this prophetic utterance is the context for understanding Jesus' later stormy entrance into the temple, cleansing it of money changers. Matthew chapter 21 verses 12 through 14.
And that's the first part of chapter 14, 10 books every conservative must read, by Benjamin-Wiker-phd. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.